Okay, we're going to make a start. Hello, and a very warm welcome to tonight's talk, Making Plans, with Sumayya Vally and Charles Holland. I'm Charlie Monaghan, Head of Editorial at The Modern House. The Modern House is an estate agency, and we have the pleasure of selling some of the UK's best homes with a particular focus on modernist and contemporary architecture. We believe in design as a powerful force for good, from personal factors such as health and well-being to more macro themes, including community, placemaking, and architectural preservation. We're committed to expanding the remit of a state agency to have a wider cultural impact on our community, and our editorial channels and events programme sees us explore modern approaches to architecture, design and living. REBA is an institution that engages more than 100,000 audiences of all ages and backgrounds through their exhibitions, talks and learning programmes. But they are also the custodian of one of the largest architectural collections in the world, one that contains hundreds of thousands of plans. For us, this makes REBA the perfect partner for this series, which explores one of the most fundamental aspects of architectural design and communication, the plan. This series has been co-programmed by Charles Holland and Chloe Spibolo, REBA's public programs manager, and over the past 3 weeks, Charles has been leading conversations with different guest speakers. Last week, we welcomed architect and novelist Leslie Loco, who talked about the tensions of the domestic plan in Ghana. Charles Holland is an architect and the principal of Charles Holland Architects. He also writes and teaches, and he's currently Professor of Architecture at the University of Brighton and visiting Professor at ABK Stuttgart. Lastly, a few housekeeping notes. Please use the Q&A function to send any questions through to our speakers, and you're also welcome to use the chat box to say hello and tell us where you're joining from. Thank you for coming, and I'll pass over to Charles now.
Thank you very much, Charlie, for the introduction, and thanks to Chloe for organising tonight's talk. Okay, so tonight is the third and the final talk in this short series called Making Plans. In the series, we've tried to explore the relationship of the architectural plan, that most conservative and stable of drawings, with the myriad complex and sometimes uncontrollable things that go on within it. We focused on the domestic plan in particular as a place that holds secrets about our lives and offers a key to how we organise our relationships, our families and ourselves. The intellectual prompt for the series is an essay by the historian Robin Evans entitled Figures, Doors and Passages. The essay explores the relationship between plans and forms of domestic and social organisation through architectural history. It describes, for instance, how the evolution of specific forms of domestic plan both reflected and helped to form ideas about privacy, the separation of age groups, genders, classes, etc. In Marxist terms, we could talk about the plan as a real abstraction, something that is both a form of representation, but also a kind of concrete lived experience. We live in plans, and the power structures they embody in all sorts of insidious, obvious and less obvious ways. The ways they divide domestic space into rooms for different people, for instance, between parents and children, or historically between servants and the families they served. They also reflect wider cultural traditions, ways of living, and carry the traces of historic and political cultures. In the first talk, we looked at the plan of a house by Itsuko Hasegawa with Ahmed Belkoja of Fala Italia, a plan that explored tensions between formal domestic interests and everyday domestic life. In the second talk, Leslie Loco described the plan of her own house in Accra in Ghana, and she spoke about the shifting language of domestic space during colonial and post-colonial times, and the way that we use language to describe domestic space orally as well as through the drawn plan. This week, I'm really thrilled to introduce Sumayya Vally to talk tonight. Sumayya is the director of the Johannesburg-based practice Counterspace. Counterspace is a collaborative architectural studio which is inspired by its location and committed to developing design expression through research, publishing, pedagogy, built things, buildings, and other forms of architecture. The studio occupies a space between the functional and the speculative, pedagogy and praxis, simultaneously describing cities and their histories and futures and imagining them. Sumayya is also involved in teaching, leading a unit at the Graduate School of Architecture in Johannesburg. Last year, Counterspace were commissioned to design the 2020 Serpentine Pavilion, a fantastically exciting commission for such a young practice. Due to COVID, the pavilion will hopefully open in 2021 instead. And in the meantime, Sumayya has been undertaking research into diverse communities in London, which form an integral part of her proposal, which I think she'll touch on tonight. So this is a really exciting time to hear Sumayya talk, and I'm really looking forward to what she's got to say. So I'm going to hand over to you, Sumayya, for your presentation. Good evening.
Thank you so much. Hi, Charles. I'm so honored to be invited to speak here with Modern House and RIBA, and I'm especially delighted to be in conversation with you. I've titled this presentation Intimate, Incriminate, Implicated Architectures, and it draws together a constellation of interests around the construction of home and belonging across territory and geography in particular, looking at how people make a city a place to be held through ritual gatherings in spaces in the crux of the urban environment at various scales, from the scale of the body to the scale of the cosmos. I'm going to share my screen now and get going. Intimate, incriminate, implicated architectures. In South Africa, the Natives Land Act of 1923 legislated on a broad front to regulate the presence of Africans in the urban areas. It gave local authorities the power to demarcate and establish African locations on the outskirts of wide urban and industrial areas, and to determine access to and funding of these areas. This sedimented in legislation that blacks would live next to toxic areas, mine dumps, and industrial buffer zones in Joburg. On windy days, some townships are covered in yellow dust. Buffer zones for whites are zoos, parks, and trees. Narratives of the apartheid city were shaped by and sustained by those who pioneered and promoted urban planning in South Africa, which developed a strong argument about South African architects' involvement in the creation of standardized housing for Africans. Until now, big cities still constitute the main reference for both critics and promoters of South African urban planning, and their analyses often subscribes to ideas of rapidly growing cities, inevitable housing crises, slums, and chaos. Apartheid spatial planning attempted to homogenize living areas for blacks. A material manifestation of this can be seen in the NE 51/9 or Non-European Edition 9 of 1951, Seeley's houses in standardized neighborhoods, to which Africans were forcibly removed. Townships were planned as dusty, homogeneous, gridded, infrastructureless spaces. But homes became spaces for meeting in secret. Networks of homes held exiled bodies. The kitchen table and the bedroom were sometimes spaces where charters were written and pirate radio stations were built. And much life was developed in the cracks between houses. Streets, shebeens, and yards became lively centers for social functions. Shebeen queens reigned, jazz movements were born. The corner shop and the bakery became sites of everyday resistance and community. In Johannesburg, a site and center of migrant history and migration, this phenomenon still continues, with hybrid typologies developing in the construction of belonging, conglomerates between host and home, domestic and public, near and far. Geographies and territories are entangled and bound. Additionally, the role of architecture has been to confine or control space, shaping historical experience and social relations in static form. As a result, the history of peoples for whom movement, forced or voluntary, not stasis, is the predominant experience, does not find easy or direct translation into form. Searching for forms and histories in the architectures of both migration and subverting control in the construction of belonging holds the potential and possibility for new design expressions for identity and political freedoms. Home at the scale of the table. Project, a Pan-African gathering, Geography, Wuzhen Biennale, China, Dar Addis Kinshasa, Nairobi, Lagos, Accra, Casablanca, hybridized by Joburg. Home, belonging, and archives of our identities are held in rituals of gathering in recipes, ingredients, myths, songs, and stories. In this project, a gathering table is proposed, a living archive of Joburg food and gathering rituals from homes that have traveled across the continent and momentarily settled in Johannesburg. What color is your jollof? A dinner table where visitors are invited to take a seat at the table and share a meal with the person next to them while reading recipes, traditions, and rituals from across Africa. The configurations of the table are drawn and extrapolated from the eating rituals of Yeovil, known as the center of Africa in the city for its densities of African roots and presences. Home at the scale of the city. Hijra refers to immigrating, passing, or coming, a word with both Latin and Arabic roots. Historically, it describes the Prophet Muhammad's flight from Mecca to Medina, escaping persecution. Included in its etymology are the words for departure, exodus, and journey. Interestingly, in Urdu, the term has come to mean fluidity of identity, or third identity, of gender and culture in particular. In this definition, the body is understood to be a literal site of transition, a vessel through which culture and identity journey, a place in which both are housed. Bodies are archives too. Project Brixton Mosque. Geography Brixton, Johannesburg. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. 5 times a day. The church bells used to clang to 9 o'clock on Sundays. A new set of harmonies. Sunrise, sunset. Conversion of an old Dutch Reformed church into a mosque. A minaret made of light appears at only 5 times in the day. On Fridays, the new street edge is animated. Children climb, traders trade, people meet. A form emerges, a geometric merge between the old church arches and new parabolic orders. New and old dreamers, wishers, worshippers from 2 religions and times. The architectures pray together, reveal and conceal, hide and seek, past, present, future. A reimagination of a meshed religious space. Introduction of archetypal Islamic geometric representations into the solid presence of the inherited church building. Backlit 9mm translucent polycarbonate on 30 by 76mm lightweight steel substructure, bolted to parapet of existing turret. A light is switched on 5 times a day. The church bell tower is turned into a minaret. 250mm reinforced concrete monolithic arches to engineer's spec. Translucent concrete colonnade, second skin, a refuge from the street. Home at the scale of the border. Port, a space of crossing, of transition, of crossover. A highly programmed space, akin to an airport, where slippages of control, territory, and access have consequences that far exceed the port's actual geography. Crossings and controls of species, of things, of conditions. Project Istanbul Biennial 2020. Geography Istanbul. Recipes installed in shop fronts and markets in Cairo and Casablanca. The granular content of soil, the molded clay of a fluted utensil, the earth of a communal bakery, and the dasturkhan. Climate change and shifting sands, shifting borders. Material and ingredients, the stuff of the earth, and their legacies of hybridization, uproot, movement, and endangerment are an evolving archive of our own stories. Fragments of data, hard and soft, trace the shifting of species, geographies, and practices. A periodic table of land and sea, excavating and underlining potential histories, potential futures. Khushari, the national dish of Egypt, has its roots in khichdi, a rural North Indian dish brought to Egypt by homesick Indian soldiers of the British Raj, carrying lentils in their pockets. Active leftovers, quiet histories, silent sovereignties, gradated empires, new categorizations, ecological shifts, carceral atlases of colony politics and resistance. the deep fault lines of control and moments of insurgence. These folding architectures containing cultural recipes and histories of movement are installed in everyday use in Cairo and Casablanca. A sandwich wrapper, a falafel house shop window poster, a tablecloth in the central market for fast break. On the scale of the cosmos, Sangomas, highly respected healers among the Zulu people of South Africa, who diagnose, prescribe, and perform ritual to heal a person physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. Johannesburg 2020. Connect with your ancestors. Advertisements by some Sangomas. Facebook and WhatsApp consultations and treatments. Divination, healing physical, emotional, and spiritual illnesses, directing birth or death rituals, finding lost cattle, protecting warriors, counteracting witchcraft, and narrating the history, cosmology, and myths of their tradition. Traditional healers are consulted by 60% of South Africa. Claim heritages, reconfigure and uncover histories, fuse places, times, geopolitics, and geopoetics. Project Johannesburg Lasts. Dating back to the beginnings of Joburg, Mai is a traditional spiritual homestead in the city, a refuge for laborers from rural areas who make transient homes in the city. This interactive web-based platform allows readers to trace the deep histories of influences and elements of life at Mai. Observed in mining and historical remnants found to the west of the city, this drawing begins with a land register of ground radioactivity in the village main mine area. Traveling north through the city's groundwater, burning of the crops some weeks later, the effects of the Mpepu herb are altered and augmented. A spiritual network mutates, frequency of millions of voices, messages, and invocations, accessible through a small portal in Jamestown, Johannesburg. Project traces a speculative anomaly, partly real and partly imagined, through Kolwa's Enterprise, a micro radio station on the fringes of Kwamamai. She has acquired the ability to tap into the supernatural communication network using a massive transistor radio set up on the roof of her shop. Regularly holds programming of various selected contributions made by people on the other side of Joburg. Like her, there are several other network channels in the area, adverts of offerings pasted to every visible concrete bin, billboard, or electrical distribution box. Through this event and its resultant economies, the presence of Joburg's remains are seen as perpetual, continuous, lasting, haunting, a reminder of histories and legacies surfacing in everyday Joburg life and belonging. A reminder of the meteorite that struck the city, forming its gold 2 billion years ago, and of severed ancestral ties, entanglements of place, empire, and extraction. Home at the scale of the table, the city, the border, the cosmos. London, a gathering of structures entangled in the contemporary ways in which people have made the city a place to take hold in and a place in which to be held. Endangered and erased spaces of belonging. The Mangrove, the unofficial headquarters of the Notting Hill Carnival. The Centerprise Publishing House, a home for community publishing and events. Four Aces Club in Dalston, the first venue to play black music in Britain. Thousands of corner shops, hundreds of salons, multitudes of porch steps for neighborliness. An iftar in the street to remember those who were lost in the Grenfell fire. Places for the expression and configuration of identity, place, and belonging. Histories are always present. Geographies and territories are entangled and bound.
Thank you. That was amazing. Incredible number of things, provocative and really important ideas thrown up by that. Quite hard to know where to start, actually. I might start maybe with asking about the most sort of concrete manifestation of planning and the plan in a kind of fairly horrific way of the use of, you mentioned at the beginning of that presentation, really, the use of very particular ways of planning a place to divide people, obviously through apartheid, but through the placing of housing in relation to toxic waste sites or other kind of unpleasant devices, I guess, which is just an incredibly shocking concept, really, to be looking back on. And you mentioned a particular house type, I think, which I wrote down and subsequently lost, but Standardised Plan NE 5109 Edition 9. And that refers, does it, to a specific house type that was rolled out in large numbers in townships. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. I think living in South Africa, and I don't know, being an architect in particular, it is really horrific, as you said, and at the same time interesting that we have to deal with this challenge of the way that our cities were planned. And I think it really points to the power of architecture for me, and the power of the plan, as you said in your introduction, in that, you know, it was really planning devices that were used to segregate people. And as you mentioned, on the urban scale, in the most horrific of ways, non-white races were placed next to sewage plants and next to mine dumps. But also, it was so particular that Black people also lived on the south side of mine dumps, so that when the wind blew, it was ensured that, you know, they would breathe in toxic dust, and we have inherited generational lung disease and so on. And this particular house plan that you mentioned, or that's in the talk, NE 51/9, stands for Non-European Edition 9 of 1951, I think, something like that. It's interesting that at the moment the government has a very similar plan for the housing that it's rolling out right now. We call them RDP houses now, but our housing schemes have not been interrogated deeply enough on that level. We are still using effectively this inherited house plan that we have. And I think that what's also interesting is that despite this homogeneity of, trying to control something that was seen as chaotic or seen as uncivilized, life still happened in between houses, in between people's yards and in the streets and so on. So because there was very little inside the house, life spilled outside onto the streets.
Yeah. That's really interesting. I want to come back to that because I think that's something that comes through very strongly in your presentation at all sorts of scales. But just to dwell on that plan for a moment, I mean, it's interesting really in this series we probably, and in the introduction, sort of talked about, I guess, less obvious, but in some senses kind of aggressive ways that house plans divide and sort of place kind of wider societal values on how we organise ourselves, but not such a kind of nakedly sort of violent way as that. But just to dwell on that plan, I mean, what aspects of kind of domestic life were catered for in that plan? I mean, did they have particular kind of, is there at the scale of that individual house, the way that thought of families or groups to live together, were there aspects in that were very particular, and in terms of how that might have controlled or otherwise sort of influenced behaviours?
I don't know. I think that I'm sure that there are lots of embedded things in there, but I think in particular in the way that the houses were arranged in relation to streets and so on, so that access could be controlled. And I think that the way that forced entry, police entry and so on was considered was very particular. I think also things like access to light and perhaps what is most ways of being and ways of living that people already had. So in Sophiatown, for example, and in many informal settlements and areas where people made homes of their own, they were forcibly removed, homes were destroyed, and then they were resettled into something that was very gridded, very dusty, very bland in comparison to a place that was much livelier that they had come from. And as I said in the talk as well, most people who write about apartheid city planning are often comparing it to big cities and to conventional urban planning discourse, which I think also excludes a lot of the life that people had before they were resettled and before forced removals happened.
So I mean, we've obviously got some very stark examples of how certain forms of subjugation and power control might happen within the domestic plan, but then how those domestic plans are multiplied together in terms of their relationship to each other, and then how they might be placed in relation to the rest of the city, but also what's very interesting you said about that, about how they might be very directly controlled in terms of police presence. Running through your presentation, I think really strongly, is a kind of counter narrative to that, perhaps, which is how outside of those official structures, unofficial forms of life kind of happen. I don't wish to sort of romanticize those necessarily, but I think it is really interesting in terms of a form of resistance that a lot of what you talk about is actually activity as opposed to kind of form. So whether you're talking about the kind of radio stations or kind of eating and rituals, and you talk about kind of community events, and I suppose sort of ephemeral things in terms of like them not having a permanent physical form. And I think it'd be really interesting if you could say a bit more about that, perhaps as a sort of tactic in your work, that almost as if like you kind of abandon the kind of concrete nature of the plan and then start to actually think about activity as something completely different that architects could be involved in assisting, orchestrating, learning from.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really nice way to think about it. I think that, so what we see happening outside of the formal structures is what the plan effectively is excluding. So, and I think that that's why it's really interesting to learn from and draw on those things without, as you're saying, romanticizing this idea of event and ritual and the ephemeral and the atmospheric. But I think that because so much of our planning excludes certain ways of being or privileges other ways of being, it means that things have to find ways to function despite formal systems and structures. And I do really believe that on the one hand, it's interesting to think about orchestrating and about working with choreography and the ephemeral and so on in kind of expanding our architectural discourse and discipline into including ephemeral ways of working as well, which I'm very interested in. But I also believe that there are keys to those in unlocking or, imagining design form from other ritual practices and other ways of being as well.
I mean, that comes through very strongly in your in things like the research you've been doing in London already, where sort of interest in, say, nightclub or music venue in the kind of place where the Notting Hill Carnival develops as a concept, or these are things which aren't sort of massively important in architectural terms traditionally. They're about the way that kind of culture and communities take ownership of somewhere. And I think that the issue of music and broadcasting seems really interesting, because one could see that as a completely alternative idea of spatial organisation, one which is dispersed, but it has an architecture to it.
Yeah, I think, sorry.
No, carry on.
No, please.
Well, I mean, it's just another observation, I suppose, or a question, very practical question about your work, actually, which is you do a lot of stuff with light. So with the Brixton moss, the light is the thing that comes on. Is that part of a similar sort of interest in a sort of non-material architecture?
Yeah, I think so. I'm really interested in things that are atmospheric. So often when I often say that my favorite materials to work with are light, color, and sound. But I think that it's also just in thinking through the homes and in things that we find in other ways of being. There is something I want to say. I don't know. Let me just give me a minute. But it's in looking at ways of being that are about or that preference. This idea of things that are embodied or of ritual practice. It's much less about, say, monumentalizing, or to use a Western framework. It's not so much about petrifying, but it's about remembering or about doing in a way that is ritualistic or that is about an atmosphere or something. So I think there's I wouldn't say I'm getting it right, but I definitely have an urge to work with materials like light, or to work with color and to work with the sonic as a way to insert something else into architecture, to kind of, I don't know, travel it, or I'm really trying to figure something out, I think, working with
this might sound like a really banal question, but does that mean that you avoid sort of traditional forms of drawing when you're making things? If the issue, for instance, is a kind of ritual or event, how do you draw that, or how do you conceive of that as an architect?
No, I absolutely don't avoid traditional forms of architecture. I love architecture very much and very deeply. But I do think that, and coming back to this idea of the plan, that there is a lot that is excluded from our conventional and traditional tools. So I think that maybe a way to think about it is that they have, or in my case in particular, I'd like for them to be supplemented with other things. And we talked about this when you were in Johannesburg as well, but I think there is something to be said for different drawing languages that is trying to work through or translate or understand something about a context that can't be held in a traditional drawing alone. So I also am interested in working with film and in working with other media to be able to draw a ritual or draw event, draw atmosphere. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, I mean, it's knowing your work a little bit, it's also very rich formally, which I think is really interesting. And I want to come back to that. Maybe we could talk about that a little bit later, and maybe in relation to the Serpentine a little bit. So I want to preempt that. But again, it's an example of something where I think it's both kind of formally rich, but also conceptually very engaging, and they're often not found together. One might find conceptually rich stuff, but sort of not necessarily find a kind of physical language for that. But I want to jump onto a slightly different topic in the meantime, which is scale, which is obviously comes through your presentation very much as a kind of structuring device. And also I think it's interesting as well, I mean, the presentation I thought was really revealing formally because it was super rich, but also quite dynamic in the sense it seemed, it was doing lots of things at different times and different ways, which I think is quite unusual. For architects are often much more kind of procedural and sort of logical in the way they go. I drew a plan and then I made this thing, and here's a photograph of it finished. So I found the presentation really interesting, the way it sort of actively explored those ideas. But on the topic of scale, I thought it was interesting because you seem on one hand to be talking about the home and sort of certain forms of quite small scale social organisation, and at the same time seeing those things that actually manifest themselves at the scale of the city or bigger scales than that. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, because I think understanding the concept of home or domesticity even as something which is actually not confined to an individual space, but is about communities scattered or collective in some way, or even global.
I think it's something that I've been reflecting on so much in this year, and to a degree I've been a little bit, I don't want to say disappointed, but disappointed in myself at how reliant I am on the city to feel a sense of home. And I also think that I thought through the presentation in this way because of that, because I think that the domestic environment is one thing, but it's also interesting that when people are settle in a new place or migrate, that they find ways to construct belonging and community and home at other scales, in the urban fabric, and also I think that sometimes in many cases, I'm thinking of Yeovil, which I mentioned in particular in the presentation, in Johannesburg, because there is no space in the home. It also becomes that communal spaces and so on become places where people meet every day for their daily meals and, construct a sense of community and, in a sense, an extended family network in a new place. So I think absolutely it does translate from the scale of the small ritual to much bigger things like radio station or being able to stay connected virtually. All of these things I think have a place in the way that people construct belonging and identify. And I think that's also interesting to reflect on in this time, especially when things are so fluid and so evolving. And although it is very challenging, I think it also holds possibilities for us to think about how we construct our own environments differently, or how we define them, at least.
In the context of your, that history of the townships, that idea of public space seems particularly kind of provocative. And I think, historically architects think of public space very much as a sort of formal idea, like it's literally a space. It's a kind of an urban form, rather than kind of activities. Or we might say that you find public space just as much kind of in a group of people sitting and out in front of their house on an early evening, or going to a club or whatever. These are forms of public space that architects traditionally don't necessarily recognise. Is that something that you're consciously looking at, particularly in the London stuff, that you're trying to find what is a kind of public space?
Absolutely. I think it's also important that we do recognise these other smaller things that you're speaking of as important public spaces, but also important spaces of cultural production, because I think they're increasingly under threat because they're not being valued in those ways. And some of the examples I gave, I think, have been demolished quite recently. And when they were demolished, they left huge cultural voids. There are movements that are happening now to try and, combat or fill those voids in some way. So I met recently with a group of people who is starting a Trinidadian recipe sharing project in response to some of these spaces having been demolished in the early 2000s. So I think that for me, it's very important that we do start expanding what our idea of public is. And in Johannesburg, it's really fraught because we have so many different publics and our cities are still so segregated. But we also do see the same instances of people coming together and constructing belonging and community and a sense of public in these small spaces.
Can I ask you just a little bit about the project Serpentine? Because when it was announced that you'd got it, I thought that's a tremendously exciting, sort of bold choice. And the visuals are kind of intriguing. How much of it is sort of designed and how much of it is developed through your research? Because you're doing the research at the moment, aren't you?
Yeah, it's all developed from the research. So I moved to London in December, and I really worked on developing the forms then. I spent lots of time at the Bishopsgate library archives. I spent ages in the pamphlet collection, and I found some of these spaces that I'm talking about. But I also spent a lot of time walking in neighborhoods and taking photos and so on. And this research is being extended now, but it's also being extended to how we can work with communities and looking at developing programs in other locations and extending the reach of the pavilion into the city. But all of the forms were all developed in relation to research that I was doing on the ground at the time. And it was also really important for me that I was able to be there during that process.
One of the places you mentioned when we chatted very briefly before this was at Edgware Road, which I was super interested in, because if one's talking about ideas of sort of home or culture or specific way that an area might be sort of transformed by the sort of arrival of completely different kind of signifiers of home. That's an area I always think of in London that has this sort of fascinating shift in it as a consequence of the kind of population that moved there and changed it. And there's sort of nothing's sort of changed in the kind of hard infrastructure, but everything's changed in the kind of soft infrastructure of how spaces are used and the sort of food that you can buy there and the restaurants that you can go to in the community that lives there. Is that did you kind of pick that area after some research, or you kind of knew it already, or?
A little bit of both. I know London a little bit. And I also, I don't know, my experience of looking for halal food and so on, but also just, walking to different cultural institutions in the city did give me some insight into those spaces. But also the Serpentine has a rich history of working with the Edgware Road, I think over the past 10 years, if not longer. So I think it became a really clear decision to work with them in building on a body of work and in building on their networks and connections and tapping into those. I think I worked with a lot of spaces in the beginning, and I'm not going to be able to physically work with so many of them, unfortunately, budget and logistics and so on. But the ambition of the project also is to work with nodes in each direction. And the Edgware Road is, it's definitely somewhere I want to work with. And
well, I guess one of the reasons it seems super interesting is just its centrality, and that, the fact that it's next to Hyde Park and it's central London, and with such kind of interesting kind of demographic and identity. What's interesting, I think, as well to me, through the series of talks, is this relationship between, kind of interesting, quite formal things about domestic planning, and your talk, which starts with that and then in a way kind of explodes that, just sort of says, well, you have to kind of transcend the sort of physical, in the particular case of, the township house as well, transcend the sort of both the meagerness of the architecture and the kind of restrictions of the social and political circumstances. I just wonder, when a lot of your work is involved in the city, when you look at the kind of domestic plan at its own scale, at that size, how does this thinking come to bear on that? If you were to design a new house, where it is just at the scale of the kind of, what individual family units say, Does this thinking come to bear on that, or how does it come to bear on that?
Yeah, I think absolutely. And I also think that what I was trying to work with in bringing together these different scales is to work through this idea that the politics perpetuates at scale, from the scale of a seating arrangement to the scale of how the urban environment is arranged. And I think, I mean, there are the tiniest instances of how the body was controlled in apartheid space as well, by not providing seating and so on in areas where people were meant to eat. And that had really interesting impacts on how food packaging was designed, because people had to eat it while walking and so on. So I think that, you know, we can't help but be influenced by these various scales and politics at the same time. I also have worked on designing domestic spaces in like rural areas in Mpumalanga, and in some of my work in the Valley of a Thousand Hills in KwaZulu-Natal. It's also very far from the urban environment, and it's also at the scale of the domestic. But I think that there is something that or an attitude that I want to bring to those spaces about how the edge works, about having a fatter edge, a softer edge, something that's more porous. So for example, in this project I mentioned in the Valley of a Thousand Hills, it's a home for girls. And what we worked with there was having an edge on the outside that responded to the community and so on. It became very much about communal functions, but then also very protected and private and interior space for girls. Because I think that is also very important.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting. I'm conscious that we're moving quickly through time as well as space here, and I want to have some time for questions. And we've got 2 questions from Una Haran here. Una says, firstly, thank you for an amazing presentation. I'm interested to know how the patterns of living that people experienced prior to apartheid forced relocations compare to the patterns in the non-European housing.
Very interesting question, Una. I think that I won't be able to do the question justice, because of course there are so many different ways of living and being that were lost. But certainly many of those were much more communal. If we think of traditional homesteads and so on, and people who were living out in rural areas, that life was much more communal, and amenities and so on were shared. And I think that there was, in many of those, there were much more generous gestures in the planning and in the ways that people lived. I think even though, despite the way that townships were planned, that communal life still did translate, as Charles was saying, to some degree. So people still bring with them what they can, despite the formal restrictions. But yeah, I think there are many ways, and also many different cultures were forcibly removed and so on. And different ethnicities and races. So each of those, I think, was, of course, they all overlap, or many of them overlap, but there were lots of different ways of being that were effectively erased.
Thank you. There's a follow-up question as well, which is does touch on something that we've spoken about already, but maybe more directly put here, which is in relation to sort of unplanned spaces. So maybe following on from what you just said there, the fact that certain kinds of social activity will kind of happen anyway, or will sort of emerge despite the sort of attempts to stop it. As architects, can we design those, or do they always emerge organically from the communities themselves? So the question says, maybe as architects we should be leaving space for these publics to grow rather than trying to provide preemptive ideas. And I think that's a really if I might just sort of add a bit to that myself, I suppose that's a sort of perennial question, I suppose, isn't it, about sort of deterritorialization and territorialization, that in architects trying to design spaces for spontaneous activity, we somehow stop it from happening, that we're sort of re-territorializing something which isn't about architecture, it's about other things. So perhaps you could just sort of speak a little bit more about how we intervene, or how you intervene in something which isn't traditionally a sort of occupation of architects.
I think, this also comes back to my interest in atmospherics. I think in my city, there are so many beautiful, interesting spaces, and, very poetic and evocative atmospheric experiences that we have. For example, if I can think of something, there are church groups who occupy leftover pieces of land, and it feels almost like a paranormal wilderness to be in some of those spaces. Again, without romanticizing, without being, I don't know, inappropriate about it. I think that there's a lot of really amazing atmospheres and experiences, but I also do really believe in the agency and the power of the architect. I think that part of the reason why things fail when we try to plan for them is because we overlook those aspects sometimes, like the atmospheric. So I mean, if, I don't know, an architect were to design a structure for this group that I described, if those atmospheric things weren't taken into consideration, and there wasn't a process of dialogue and of listening, then I think that would be killed, absolutely. And so much of what we see is that these ways of being are killed by architecture. But I think it's not because we shouldn't be designing for them. It's because our ways of designing haven't included and incorporated forms of drawing or ways of working that can accommodate those. It's almost like those ways of being and living are ahead of the tools that we have, and we need to catch up and invent different ways to draw. But yeah, I believe in the power of architecture and in the agency of the architect. So I know it's a controversial view, and I often get asked it, but I think we should be, even on a conceptual level, it's exciting and interesting to be working with that.
Yeah, well, I mean, as I said, I think earlier, I feel that's super interesting about your work is the combination of a sort of interest in working, with these kinds of history, social histories, community kind of life, and a real sort of love of architecture, and that the kind of formal richness of your work is really refreshing, because I think, and it avoids the sort of, history of sort of radical chic of, sort of certain very formal interests in pretending to be interested in what people do. I think you managed to kind of avoid that completely, while also investing what you do design with a real kind of richness of the vocabulary. So that's really great. We've got one more very quick question. It's not a quick question, but hopefully you can give it a quick answer, because I know that time is pressing. This is from someone called Anonymous Attendee. And their question is about architecture and education. Could you mention a few things you would change or remove from the typical curriculum? What would you add or take out of the way that we traditionally teach architecture?
Great question, and I'm trying to practice this all the time. I think I'm really concerned with how history is edited, and how, in the same way that the plan can include and exclude, I think also curricula and indexes and archives also include and exclude. So I would include more and other forms of knowledge, other ways of being that are perhaps embodied or that fall outside of formal structures. And in my own work with my students, we do try to work on drawing in different ways, often work with sound, we work with things that are oral and performed. I think you saw Guguletti's work last week that Leslie showed. So I think it's about expanding. So I wouldn't necessarily remove anything, but I think I would expand to include other forms of doing.
I think that's a really important point and a really nice way maybe to sort of end. And it's not about taking anything out, it's about expanding the repertoire of what we do as architects and expanding our sort of understanding of what kind of architecture can be. So I just want to, well, before sort of wrapping up the series, so firstly, thank you very much, Sumayya. It's been total pleasure and really inspiring to talk to you, hear about the work and discuss really kind of incredibly important issues around architecture and power, I guess, ultimately. For anyone who's interested, and I'm sure everybody is, in hearing more about what you're doing for the Serpentine Pavilion, I know that you're doing a talk on Sunday at midday with Yasmin Lari, which is part of the weekend festival for the Serpentine Pavilion. So I'll certainly want to tune in for that, and I'm sure other people will. And I'm massively looking forward to what emerges from your research and seeing the Serpentine Pavilion, which is tremendously exciting. And I'm obviously fingers crossed that we all get to be able to go to events like that again next summer. So first, thank you so much, Sumayya. That's been brilliant. Yeah, really enjoyed that. I'm going to do some more general sort of summing up and thanks. And I know you have a Serpentine related event to jump onto. So if we don't see you, thank you again.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for having me. Bye.
Thanks, Sumayya. So I'm just going to finish briefly in the last couple of minutes we've got. I just want to, I guess, thank Chloe Spivey-Lowe, firstly, for working on this short series with me, which has been tremendous fun, and Marie Beck-Mortensen for inviting me to do it. It's been really fascinating because it's a subject that's really close to my heart, both in the sense of loving the kind of architectural plan as a sort of formal object and a kind of aesthetic and compositional aspect of architecture, but always having been super interested in and felt it's very important to acknowledge the kind of power relations and the social relations that are embodied in the plan. And I've repeatedly sort of gone back to refer to the Robin Evans essay, and that's probably because it's the first thing that I read about architectural plans that alerted me to the fact that the kind of history of architectural style and stylistic development was something that was deeply connected to the way that social, political and economic and cultural frameworks have developed, and that the relationship that the plan has with it is a very particular kind of sense of both reflecting those structures but also making them too. The plan kind of constructs social relations as much as it reflects existing ones, and I think we saw that incredibly powerfully tonight in Sumayya's presentation, talking about a kind of really aggressive use of how a plan, both on the level of an individual house and also on the planning of a social settlement and community, can force through particular kinds of relationship, in this case hugely violent and problematic ones. So I am going to draw this short series to close. Thank everybody who came and in the virtual sense to join in. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks very much to Charlie and the Modern House for supporting the series as well. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it sparks further interest as well. And I'm going to say thank you very much and good night to everyone. Thank you.